about the time that I came back, the residency program was in sort of need of somebody who could take over and direct the residency program. And since I was sort of not very busy, so to speak, my department chair said, I want you to do that. So I said, oh, okay, fine, that's fine. I had a little bit of interest in medical student education because when I was a graduate student, I actually had to design and teach a class in medical school because part of the PhD requirement at that time was you were going to go into a faculty position and you needed to know something about teaching. So part of my graduate work actually was going to the university.
Welcome to another edition of the TrustCast Show, and I'm really excited to have with us Frederick McCurdy, MD, PhD, MBA. We're just talking just before the show, and I was kind of going to go through what I usually start off with an intro, and he started with what I thought was a way better intro than I had. And just say what you told me.
Medicine was not my first career. I was working for the U.S. Forest Service in 1968, and President Johnson conscripted me to go fight in his war in Southeast Asia, and that changed my entire life dramatically in more than one way. The first was the 56 days that I spent in basic training, and then a whole bunch of other things happened along the way, and eventually I ended up back in school, and this time pursuing medicine. But that was not what I chose to do when I left college. I wanted to work I basically wanted to work outdoors because I liked camping and all of that sort of thing. And the U.S. Forest Service offered me a really nice little job, and so I was a disease control research assistant, which is a fancy title for I drove a truck and counted trees.
So that was your career path at the time. You thought this is nirvana, huh?
Well, as a matter of fact, I thought it was nirvana because it was in the Klamath National Forest right along the Oregon-California border. It got me outside. I could go trout fishing in the morning and catch a couple of pan trout for breakfast. And we worked 10 days and then we had 4 off. So that gave me a chance to explore a little bit of California. I lived in true Northern California. Northern California is referred to as the Bay Area, but I lived way north of the Bay.
In God's country there.
Yeah, well, it was actually President Roosevelt used to go to Beaver Creek Lodge on the Klamath River and catch steelhead trout.
Yeah, that's some good fishing down there. So, so you went from doing that, and then, but you retired an Air Force colonel. So how did that all work out? You ended up getting into medicine, but you stayed in the military. Is that right?
Yes. I did my 3 years in the military. The last 16 months, I was assigned to an Army hospital working in a lab. The backstory to that was that I had worked in a hospital lab during college to pay for college because my parents couldn't afford to send me to school. So I had this job, which was about 32 hours a week, that I worked in a hospital lab doing a variety of different things. They started out having me washing glassware, and eventually ended up being the chief of hematology. And it was kind of a really interesting job, and I enjoyed it. But my first passion was field biology. I mean, just plain and simple. And then I got drafted. I got shipped overseas, this time to Germany. I was in a combat unit in the 3rd Infantry Division. I was working in the Signal Corps at the time. And I managed to figure out a way to get myself transferred to the hospital because that got me out of the field. It got me away from trucks and guns and all of that sort of thing, which was not my particular cup of tea. And I was working in the hospital lab, and a couple of doctors, a pediatrician in particular, a pediatrician and a surgeon who happened to be in the hospital pretty much all the time, and mostly at night when we were on call. We were on call every third night. We had to spend that night in the hospital, so to take care of the emergency room and to provide laboratory coverage, round the clock. They would come by periodically and talk to me, and eventually they started talking to me about, you need to go into medicine. You need to be a doctor. And I said, no, I'm not really interested. And they just kept it up. Just, it was sort of an incessant conversation. Eventually, they did get into my head, and I had met a guy. His name is Perry Rigby. He's now deceased. But he was a he was an adult cancer doctor. He was an adult oncologist, and he persuaded me to come back because I'd met him through a connection at a National Science Foundation. It was really kind of a weird connection. I met him. I met with him a few times. He had me come and visit his lab before I got drafted, and he invited me to come back and be a graduate student in his lab. And little did I know at the time that he really had been kind of researching me and trying, asking a bunch of people about me, et cetera, et cetera. What he was trying to do is he was trying to start an MD PhD program, which was brand new, a brand new kind of process in medicine. And he thought that I would be an ideal candidate for that. So he persuaded me to come back as a graduate student. And about 6 months into that, he and some medical students that were working in the lab cornered me in his kitchen, literally, and plied me with beer and convinced me that I needed to go to medical school.
Well, that is usually most students are really kind of struggling. I've got to take all these tests and how can I get into medical school? You took a totally different route.
As a matter of fact, a medical student was sitting right over here yesterday, and he was here for clinic. I have medical students that rotate through my clinic, and we were talking about medicine, and he was telling about how he thought about medicine and this, that, and the other thing. And he looked at me and he says, "So how did you get into medicine?" I said, "I didn't choose medicine. Medicine chose me."
It's an interesting route
story
that you went into. So you've been a military officer, a kidney doctor for kids, medical school professor, and now a healthcare business consultant. What's the thread that connects all of those?
Well, the throughput, or the through line, is that I'm an academician, and I got my MD. I got my medical degree, and I was doing research at the same time. I continued to do research after I got finished with medical school, even when I was a resident, because it seemed like a reasonable thing to do, and I had the intellectual curiosity. I changed my research focus from being a cancer immunologist to kidney disease because of the need in the military at the time. I was in the Air Force, and the Air Force had no pediatric nephrologist anywhere. And so my mentor, Bob DeLemus, said, "I'd like for you to think about becoming a nephrologist." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Well, because most kids' kidney disease is immunologically based. You got a PhD in immunology. You understand the kidney. You seem to have a pretty good mind about physiology. So you need to do that." And I thought about it, and I explored it, and seemed to make a lot of sense. So I went and I trained in University of Minnesota. But while I was still a resident, I was doing some bench work research on renal blood flow and some other things because it, sort of spoke to my interest in bench physiology. Finished that, came back to where I trained. I was a pediatric nephrologist, and about the time that I came back, the residency program was in sort of need of somebody who could take over and direct the residency program. And since I was sort of not very busy, so to speak, my department chair said, I want you to do that. So I said, oh, okay, fine, that's fine. I had a little bit of interest in medical student education because when I was a graduate student, I actually had to design and teach a class in medical school because part of the PhD requirement at that time was you were going to go into a faculty position and you needed to know something about teaching. So part of my graduate work actually was going to the University of Nebraska at Omaha and taking some classes in curriculum design and tests and measurements and one other thing which I can't remember. So I had some background in that. And he said, okay, so I want you to take over the residency program. And oh, by the way, the last time that they were here to visit us and to reaccredit our program, we were dinged for not having a curriculum. You need to write a curriculum.
Oh, since you're not doing much.
And I said, you have any idea how complicated that is? Because part of the graduate work that I'd done was in designing curricula. And he says, well, I think you can probably figure that out. So I figured it out and wrote a curriculum for the residency program. Got a lot of help from a lot of people, to include the Canadians who had actually done a lot of that work. And I just borrowed a lot of stuff from them through the peer-reviewed literature. I came across some stuff that they were doing, put this together, and they liked it, and my department chair liked it, and then the Air Force saw that as, oh, well, we need somebody at the military medical school called Uniformed Services University in Bethesda to do this kind of work. Would you be interested in doing that? And I was thinking, well, I'm probably going to get out of the Air Force. And this guy says, well, let me tell you, if you stay, we'll reassign you. And I said, what kind of guarantee do I have? And he says, it's written in stone. Okay. So I signed up, and then I went to the military medical school. I spent time principally as the director of undergraduate medical education for the Department of Pediatrics. Spent a lot of time working on various and sundry things. And then I got interested in research, but this time the research was more along the lines of teaching, learning, how faculty teach, how they develop their own career, that kind of stuff. And that kind of changed my whole career trajectory to medical education. And then I sort of started getting into the idea of faculty development because there's a lot of that involved there. And then I got out of the Air Force and retired, went back to where I had gone to medical school. And the department chair there right away took me under his wing and said, I'm going to mentor you to be a department chair because you have all the makings of being a department chair. And oh, by the way, you need to go to graduate school and learn about business. And I said, why, Bruce? He said, because medicine is a big business and you need to learn about that. And so that's how I got there. And that led to me creating this consulting company that was in the business realm. And that's morphed into being a medical expert witness because there aren't many pediatric nephrologists that have that kind of background that approach the legal issues from a scholarship standpoint. So that's why I'm doing it.
What is So let's talk about is that what your primary thing now? Because I see it on here, Training Doctor LLC, and then you had you're a founding member of CAMP, Children's Association for Maximum Potential,
Right.
which was kids who had trouble getting into other troubled kids,
Well,
as I
actually,
understand it.
Children's Association for Maximum Potential was an organization that sprung out of a need to have a camp for kids with disabilities. There was a kid by the name of Matt. He was one of my patients. He had Eagle-Barrett syndrome, couldn't bend over to put on his ankle foot orthosis, which is like a posterior splint on the lower extremity. Couldn't put on his AFOs, and Lions Camp said, you can't come to camp if you can't put on your AFOs. He came to me really upset. I want to go to camp. So I talked to a friend of mine who worked for Lions Camp. Her name was Chris Johnson. She was an intern, and I was a third-year pediatric resident. And we sort of put our heads together and said, we need to solve this problem because there's a lot of kids that we know of that have disabilities that would like to go to camp, but there's nothing out there. So we created CAMP, Children's Association for Maximum Potential. We did that in 1979. We incorporated in 1980. I was the first treasurer of CAMP,
Well, that
and
was a long time ago.
we've been going ever since 1979. We've been going nonstop every year. We have a full year-round program. We own our own camp, and we provide respite services for children and families of children with disabilities, and that's an ongoing thing, and that's just really my passion.
That's
Um,
fantastic.
then the medical expert witness thing is something that I have developed because I have an interest in, not necessarily in the law, but I have an interest in kids with chronic medical conditions need to have advocates. And so that's how I'm advocating for them currently, along with other things.
So when they have some sort of medical condition where they need an advocate, what would be an example of something like that where you could step in and provide some
Well,
assistance?
let's take the example of Matt. Matt needed an advocate. He had a debilitating condition called Eagle-Barrett syndrome, which eventually led to him having to get a kidney transplant. They have lack of anterior abdominal muscles. They have neurogenic bowel. They have neurogenic bladder. They have all kinds of urologic problems. They get infected. They can develop hypertension. Many of them end up in end-stage renal disease and get a transplant, which is where Matt ended up. But in the meantime, somebody needed to advocate for him because he wanted to go to camp. So the way we did that was we created an organization for him to go to camp. That's one example. Another example of advocacy is I have a girl with C3 glomerulopathy. It's a very, very rare condition. It's an immune-mediated kidney disease. It's in the membranoproliferative glomerulonephritis, big long word group.
Mm-hmm.
And she needed to have a immune modulator medication called Iptocopan, and because she wasn't 18, I fought with the insurance company for 2 years to try to get her approved on a waiver to get onto that medication. And in the meantime, another drug company developed a very similar product called Pegacetacoplan or Empaveli, and they got it approved down to age 12. And as soon as mom was the one that brought this to me, she says, did you know that there's a new C3 inhibitor called Empaveli? And I said, no, tell me about it. She says, oh, let's go look at the website. I said, oh, wow, we need to get your daughter on this medication. And boom, we went about getting it. But I had fought with the insurance company for 2 years because they were just not going to budge. And then all of a sudden, I mean, those are two examples. I can give you others. Have had arguments with school systems about children with renal disease. Many children who have renal failure, or have chronic or renal conditions, have major learning disabilities, and I became sort of persona non grata with the Northside Independent School District in San Antonio because I kept calling them up and saying, "Hey, my..." And they said, "Well, we'll get to it." And I said, "No, we're going to get to it now." And then I got the mom engaged, and we actually went to an IEP. I went with mom. You know, I said she needs help. Eventually, she ended up having to get a kidney transplant, which even made the school issue even worse, at least in the short term. But at least by that time, the Northside Independent School District had been sort of they learned how to deal with me.
So it's interesting you bring this up because I had on the show about 2 weeks ago an attorney, and all he does is work on behalf of disadvantaged kids in the school that don't get services for things that are going on in their life, and so he sues. I think he said like he has sues 100 schools a year to get to and I got to know this guy, and he actually he's so magnanimous. I know he's not, he's kind of given up what would be a really otherwise very profitable business for him to do this instead because he's so motivated by it. But he was, one of those kids, a learning disabled kid growing up, and he overcame it. And so he has this really deep compassion for those kids
Right.
that are going through that.
Yeah,
So
that's very common, actually. Very common.
if
But
they're
kids
able
with
to,
chronic illness, if you look at the pediatric population and ask the question, what is the fastest growing population in pediatric medicine today? The answer is children with special health care needs. Or
and
you
what
can expand it to children and youth with special health care needs. It's a whole bunch of kids that have a whole wide variety of disabilities, disabling conditions, and they're in need of a lot of stuff. One of the problems is that when you look at these kids, they don't necessarily look abnormal.
mm-hmm.
We are kind of visual people, and if you're in a wheelchair, we know that you have a disability. But if you're sitting in the chair and you seem, in all other intents and purposes, pretty normal looking person, you don't think about them as having a disability. But they could have nephropathic cystinosis, they could have MPGN, they could have, the list goes on and on and on. And these are medical conditions that lead to sometimes very serious medical issues, but also behavioral and mental health issues and learning disabilities. And so, you know,
So
my opinion, we need to kind of rethink how we think about this population. So, and I just came from a meeting at noon where we were talking about kids with congenital heart disease that are now living into adult life, and no one on the other side of the medical divide between pediatrics and internal medicine or family medicine, nobody on that other side in the adult world knows much of anything about congenital heart disease and how to deal with it and how to manage it. Because now these kids are living into adulthood where they used to die.
mm-hmm.
And the medical medicine as a discipline has yet to adapt to the technology. It's been very slow to adapt to the technology. We have technology that's going rampant. Kids are living longer, but we're not we're not prepared to deal with it.
So you're at this stage in your career, and a lot of people are thinking about, geez, I'm going to retire, but it doesn't sound like that really describes you, does it?
Well, I'm 81, and I was born on December 3rd, 1944. So I'm not even a baby boomer. I'm a pre-boomer, and I think my mind is okay.
Seem like
I'm
it.
still seeing patients. Um, I'm still fighting with the computer system because our electronic health record just kind of went bonkers. And now I have patient information. I have charts that I need to finish, and I can't do it because your system doesn't work. Uh, no,
So
and I'm the only thing I'm doing is I've made the commitment to my wife that I'll only work 4 days a week instead of 6.
okay, so tell me about what's a typical day that you do right now.
I get up at 5, have breakfast, ride my exercise bike for about 20 or 25 minutes, walk out the door. I'm usually sitting in this chair that I'm in right now at about 6:45, 6:50. At about 7:15, I go over to the hospital, which is connected to the building that we're in right now. And I go to a thing called Morning Report, which is the first teaching conference for the pediatric residency. And then I have either meetings or I have clinic. Um, and I, do that during the day. And then after people are gone, about 5, I spend about an hour going through medical records or working on a particular project that I might be involved with. Right now, I'm getting ready to give a grand rounds presentation next month on well, I call it moving from vague to valuable. Um, it has to do with writing narrative summaries for medical student and resident assessments that have meaning as opposed to, oh, he did a great job. And they check off the box of above average, above average, above average, excellent, etc. And then great job, wonderful, pleasant. That's about it. There's nothing actionable there at all.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to be talking to our faculty about we need more data. We need detail to provide the medical students because it's important feedback. They need to have that in order to move their career to whatever level it is that they want to move to.
So
And so that's something else that I do. My day usually starts at 6:45 and ends about 6:30 in the evening.
So, for somebody who's 83 years old, some people would say, I'm kind of with you that I enjoy the process, but how do you keep your energy up after this many years of experience?
Well,
What's your diet like?
to put a fine point on it, I graduated from medical school in 1976, so I'm going to my 50th class reunion in September. How do I keep it up? I like what I do. And if you enjoy what you're doing, then you keep doing it. Plain and simple. I was a scoutmaster for many, many, many years. I'm an Eagle Scout. I have 2 sons that are Eagle Scouts.
Congratulations, that's an accomplishment. I
Well,
know as a
thanks.
scout, but I wasn't an Eagle Scout. I always, have a friend of mine who's an Eagle Scout. I know that it's a big deal.
Yeah, well, and
Succeeded for
so
life.
I was a scoutmaster for a long time, and I finally made the decision to stop being a scoutmaster when I began to question whether or not I'd like to sleep on the ground. And so, eventually, Sometimes if I'm down on the floor, it takes me a little bit of time to get up. And so I said, well, it's probably time to stop that. But I like sitting on small chairs and playing with kids and interacting with the family and advocating for them. And like this morning, I met a new family, and one of the things that I told the family was that I see this relationship as a partnership, that my job is to guide you in ways that I think are reasonable in terms of the treatment of your son. And I'm going to give you advice. I'm going to expect you to know your child's medications, and so I will ask you about that all the time. But at the end of the day, this is about me helping you navigate through this whole process and to hold your hand if I have to, and to be a shoulder to cry on if you need it.
I can tell that there's passion there. What do you say to students who maybe, since you're working so much with kids, I mean, they're not kids, they're young adults who are working either in the residency or coming up. What do you say to them if they, exhibit where they don't seem to have the passion? What do you say to encourage them to capture that flame, or can you?
I haven't really come across that recently, but in the past, I've sat the person down and said, what do you really want out of life? What is it that you want to accomplish? And a lot of times they can't answer the question, at least not initially. Um, but that's kind of one thing. I'll answer your question a little bit differently.
Okay.
A medical student about 2.5 years ago, I do a session on Thursday afternoon. It's very unstructured, and it's called On the Case, for lack of a better phrase. The objective of this 90-minute session is for the medical students and I to have a conversation. And I'm not going to be the one who dictates the nature of the conversation. The students are going to dictate the nature of the conversation. And I open up the floor and say, you can ask me anything you want. I don't care. There's nothing out of bounds, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And this medical student said, well, Dr. McCurdy, you've been doing this for quite a number of years, and you've probably seen a lot. What's the one thing that you would change about medicine? And without even thinking about it, I said, medicine is not a shift. Medicine is a profession. It's a way of life. It becomes a really unforgiving mistress. And if you're not in it wholeheartedly, with your whole body, with your whole being, then you probably ought not to be here.
Well,
And
I really,
I don't say that. Then I said to the students, I don't mean that in a pejorative manner or in a mean sense, but I went into medicine initially because I was sort of persuaded to do it, but as soon as I got into it, it became really apparent to me that this is a way of life. And one of the things that happened to me almost at the very beginning of medical school was I was watching a Jerry Lewis Telethon advertisement. This was the March of Dimes way back in the 70s.
mm-hmm.
And there was this kid with braces and crutches and was having difficulty walking, and Jerry Lewis was talking about cerebral palsy and all of the things that these kids need. Would you please give to the March of Dimes? And I teared up. It was actually, I was waiting for a Nebraska football game to come on, just to be honest.
Yeah.
And it was like, I just hit me. I want to take care of these kind of kids. And I've never deviated from that ever, ever, ever. It was just something that was inside of me. It lit a fire inside of me, and that fire is still burning pretty bright.
Well, I really appreciate you coming on the show. I want to promote this one so that other medical students can take something out of this. I really appreciate it. So thank you, Frederick. It was a real pleasure to have you on.